What if I told you that Elvis Presley, the legendary king of rock and roll, wasn't just adored by millions, but also sparked outrage so intense that one mother, closely tied to his life, considered joining a march against him? That's right. Behind the glamour, fame, and swooning crowds lies a story of shocking disapproval and deep-seated concerns. But what could possibly drive someone so close to him to such a drastic stance? Stay tuned as we reveal the unexpected events and the surprising change that turned everything upside down. Priscilla Presley, a young and impressionable girl, found herself swept into the whirlwind of Elvis Presley's fame at a time when his influence was inescapable. Like countless others, she couldn't avoid the pull of his magnetic persona. His name was on everyone's lips, his face plastered across magazines, and his music seemed to echo from every radio. To her and many of her peers, he was more than a singer. He was a phenomenon. But for Priscilla, the story was more complex. Beneath the allure of his chart-topping hits and undeniable charm lay a world of conflicting emotions and opinions. Elvis wasn't just a pop culture icon, he was a revolution in human form. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, his provocative dance moves, sultry voice, and brooding good looks had cemented his place as the king of rock and roll. To his legions of fans, he represented freedom, rebellion, and everything thrilling about the new wave of music sweeping the nation. But to more conservative minds, his performances were nothing short of scandalous. He blurred the lines between acceptable and outrageous, leaving many parents and authority figures on edge. And for Priscilla's mother, Elvis wasn't just a passing pop star, he was a symbol of danger and moral decline. Priscilla's mother made no secret of her disdain for Elvis and everything he stood for. She viewed his electrifying stage presence and suggestive dance moves as more than entertainment. She saw them as a threat. "She's a bad influence for teenage girls," she would say, convinced that his charisma aroused feelings in young women that they weren't ready to handle. To her, Elvis was more than a rock star. He was a force pulling her daughter toward something she couldn't control. The idea of her daughter being captivated by this so-called dangerous influence was enough to plant a seed of resolve in her mind, a seed that would grow into a shocking declaration. If a movement arose to march against Elvis Presley, she'd be first in line.
"If there's ever a mother's march against Elvis Presley, I'll be the first in line." This bold and shocking statement wasn't uttered by just anyone, but by someone who held a deeply personal stake in Elvis's life. It's hard to imagine such fierce disapproval of the king of rock and roll, a figure celebrated by millions. But to her, Elvis symbolized something far more dangerous than a chart-topping artist. His provocative dance moves and electrifying performances were a lightning rod for controversy, sparking debates in households across America. And for her, it wasn't just about the music. It was about the values she feared Elvis was shaking to their core. Elvis Presley's stage presence was unlike anything the world had seen before. With his swiveling hips, smoldering gaze, and unapologetic confidence, he pushed boundaries that many found exhilarating, while others were utterly scandalized. To Priscilla's mother, Elvis wasn't just performing. He was defying the conservative norms that defined her generation. His shows, described by some as daring and by others as outright obscene, became a flashpoint for moral panic. Mothers like her saw him as a direct challenge to the innocence of their daughters, and Elvis's growing influence only heightened their fears. For her, standing against him wasn't just an opinion, it felt like a responsibility. What could drive such a strong conviction? The answer, as you'll soon discover, reveals much more than just a difference in taste.
Despite her mother's strong disapproval, Priscilla couldn't help but be drawn to the magnetic force that was Elvis Presley. At first, she tried to resist. She knew how her mother felt about him and didn't want to stoke the fires of discontent. But everything changed the moment she saw him perform. On television, there he was, commanding the stage with a confidence that seemed almost otherworldly. His movements were daring, his voice full of raw emotion, and his presence absolutely captivating. It wasn't just music, it was an experience. For Priscilla, it was the first time she truly understood why millions were falling under his spell. In her memoir, Elvis and Me, Priscilla described this awakening in vivid detail. He was sexy and handsome, with his deep, brooding eyes, pouty lips, and crooked smile. He strutted out to the microphone, spread his legs, leaned back, and strummed his guitar. Then he began singing with such confidence, moving his body with unbridled sexuality. Despite myself, I was attracted. It was as if Elvis had shattered the barriers she had built to stay on her mother's side. The charisma and allure that her mother had labeled as dangerous were the very things that left Priscilla spellbound. And while she couldn't ignore the disapproval at home, her fascination with Elvis only grew. This newfound admiration created a storm of conflict in Priscilla's world. On one side was her mother, firm in her belief that Elvis was a corrupting influence and a threat to her daughter's innocence. On the other was Priscilla herself, wrestling with emotions she couldn't quite define, an intoxicating blend of admiration, curiosity, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. How could she reconcile these opposing forces? Each time she listened to her mother's stern warnings, she felt a tug in the other direction, a pull toward the man whose voice and presence seemed to promise something extraordinary. Little did she know, this internal battle was only the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. Priscilla wrestled with her growing admiration for Elvis, torn between the warnings from her mother and the image of the man she was coming to know. To her mother, Elvis represented rebellion, impropriety, and everything a teenage girl should avoid. But Priscilla saw something different, a side of Elvis that seemed to contradict every accusation. In her eyes, he wasn't just a rock star. He was a kind, respectful man with strong Southern Christian values. She had heard stories of his unwavering devotion to his parents and his deep respect for elders, always addressing them with a polite sir or ma'am. This wasn't the reckless bad boy her mother had painted. This was someone who embodied qualities she had been taught to admire. As Priscilla put it, despite all of his stage antics and lustful, tough guy looks, Elvis came from a strict Southern Christian background. For her, this grounded upbringing was proof that Elvis was more than the provocative performer her mother feared. He was a family man, loyal and respectful, with a deep sense of duty to those he cared about. These qualities, Priscilla believed, outweighed the controversy surrounding his public persona. While her mother fixated on the spectacle of his performances, Priscilla saw the humanity behind the headlines. It was this duality, rock star and Southern gentleman, that allowed her to justify her attraction, even as her mother's disapproval loomed like a storm cloud over her growing fascination. Little did she know, this understanding of Elvis would soon be tested in ways she could never have anticipated. Priscilla's first impression of Elvis Presley was far from admiration. Long before she found herself captivated by his music and persona, she was put off by an image that clashed with the values she had been raised to uphold. A school friend, eager to share her enthusiasm for Elvis, showed Priscilla a magazine featuring photos of the king. Among them was a snapshot of Elvis signing his autograph across a blonde woman's chest, a bold and provocative image that left Priscilla stunned. When I saw a picture of him signing a blonde woman's chest, I thought, "There's no way I could be part of this fan club," she later recalled. To her, it wasn't just inappropriate, it was outright distasteful, solidifying the idea that Elvis was everything her mother had warned her about. But as time passed, that initial distaste began to fade, replaced by a growing curiosity and admiration. The more she saw of Elvis, the more she realized there was much more to him than sensational headlines and provocative photos. His charisma on stage and his softer, more grounded persona offstage painted a more complex picture of the man behind the fame. Slowly, her perspective began to shift. The man who had once seemed so unrelatable, so at odds with her values, began to captivate her in ways she couldn't explain. It was this transformation, this journey from skepticism to admiration, that would ultimately pull Priscilla into a world far beyond anything she could have imagined. Despite her mother's staunch disapproval, Priscilla's life took an extraordinary turn as her connection with Elvis Presley deepened. What began as an admiration from afar quickly grew into something far more personal and profound. Against all odds and her mother's protests, Priscilla found herself stepping into Elvis's world, a world filled with fame, glamour, and controversy. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind, but they couldn't override the magnetic pull she felt toward Elvis. The barriers her family tried to build around her couldn't withstand the allure of the king of rock and roll, and Priscilla's relationship with him became a reality that no amount of disapproval could undo. But what about her mother? The woman who once declared herself ready to march against Elvis must have faced an internal reckoning when she finally met him. Here was the man she had deemed so dangerous, standing before her not as a headline, but as a person. Perhaps it was his southern charm, his respectful demeanor, or the genuine affection he showed Priscilla that began to soften her views. It's impossible to know exactly what went through her mind, but one thing is clear. Whatever she saw in Elvis changed the narrative she had long held. The man who once symbolized rebellion and moral decline became someone she could no longer easily condemn. This shift wasn't just a moment of personal growth. It was the start of a story that would go on to capture the world's attention. As we reflect on this incredible story, one thing is certain. Priscilla's journey from a rebellious teenager to the king's wife is nothing short of extraordinary. It's a tale of love, controversy, and the challenges of overcoming family objections, all set against the backdrop of Elvis Presley's iconic and complex world. Her story reminds us that even the most steadfast beliefs can be challenged when faced with the unexpected. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about Priscilla's mother's initial views on Elvis? Were her concerns justified, or do you see it differently? Share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. We'd love to know your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories like this one. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves Elvis. Your support helps us bring you more of the content you love.